It's Tuesday, the 10th of January. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, the Conservative MP Siobhan Bailey, the SNPs Kirsten Oswald, Sonia Soda from The Observer and Zoe Strimple from The Sunday Telegraph. Today,
anyone with symptoms of a respiratory infection, a cold, flu or COVID, should try to stay at home, and if you do need to leave home, wear a face covering.
Nicola Sturgeon says face masks can help ease pressure on the NHS.
No way, no way! NHS is
Law says key public services will have to provide a minimum service, even when they're on strike.
I've looked at the evidence from elsewhere in the world, in Europe and globally, and I can see that minimum safety levels work in many, many other modern European countries.
They're effectively saying that a low-paid health assistant, a nurse, a paramedic would lose their job for pursuing their right to take industrial action.
The Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill is passed. The next...
Rude passed a bill making it easier for people in Scotland to legally change their gender, but UK ministers may block it. Liz Truss said relaxing childcare regulations would boost the economy, but has Rishi Sunak scrapped the plans? You heard Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, there in the headlines, advising people to wear a mask if they have a cold or flu symptoms. It was at a press conference. Let's listen to a little bit more of what she had to say.
If you do need to leave home, wear a face covering, which fits well. More generally, we continue to advise that those over the age of 12 should wear face coverings when on public transport or in public indoor spaces. That includes hospitals, GP surgeries and other healthcare facilities. By protecting our own health in these ways, we also do help to protect the NHS.
Nicola Sturgeon said it was the most challenging winter for the Scottish NHS. So should we go back to wearing face masks to protect the health service, Siobhan?
I think two things. Face masks should be personal choice. I know the UK Health Security Agency has suggested that they might be useful, but it absolutely should come down to individuals. And if they are deciding to wear a face mask, then it should be off the back of research and deciding what type of material, but
and what would you do?
So I personally wouldn't wear a face mask. If it is required of me or it's going to make other people feel more comfortable, then I will think about it. But I think the suggestion constantly about masks being the thing to protect the NHS is for the birds. I mean, we shut down parts of the country to protect the NHS. We wore masks in the pandemic, and the masks were not the thing that's going to save. And actually, what's going to help the NHS is that some of the things that the Secretary of State were announcing yesterday.
All right. Well, sticking with the idea of masks, Kirsten, what do you say to Siobhan, who says it's for the birds to suggest that wearing a face mask, voluntary or otherwise, to protect the NHS?
I think that's wrong. That's not what Nicola Sturgeon said. That's one of a number of things that will help us to protect the NHS.
Although she's advising people with a respiratory infection, it would be better to wear a face mask because there are pressures,
that's
unprecedented
right.
pressures
but
on
of
the
course,
NHS.
there are other things that we're doing as well to try and mitigate against this. The vaccination programme is obviously vitally important. It's really important that people use services in the appropriate way. And one of the other things that we can do, and I think it's a good common sense piece of advice from Nicola Sturgeon, is in appropriate circumstances, you might want to be wearing a face mask. I'm certainly going to take on board her advice and do that in the appropriate circumstances. If it is going to if it's going to do the job of making things potentially a little bit less difficult, then
so
it's absolutely no skin off my nose to wear a face covering if I'm going into the doctor's surgery, or if I had symptoms, I would certainly be wearing a face covering. I think that's a personally responsible thing. But Siobhan also said that, she wasn't going to do that and nobody, you wouldn't do it unless somebody made you. Nobody's suggesting that somebody's going to make you go and do it. But there is, I think, a personal responsibility there that in the appropriate circumstances, that is something that we should reasonably consider.
I think
everything's changed since COVID came along, and we probably need to change our outlook a little bit.
The difference is that personal choice and assessing circumstances rather than it being a government diktat or the state giving advice from up high. I think that's what we've learned from.
I think it's the job of the state to give advice in these circumstances. I think that was a responsible thing for Nicola Sturgeon to do. All health services are suffering from winter pressures, whether it be COVID or the flu or respiratory viruses. And if we can do something to mitigate that, then that's a sensible thing for us to think about.
I mean, the question is around, should we wear face masks to protect the NHS, even if it is one of a number of measures being taken?
I mean, I sort of think what Nicola Sturgeon said is basic common sense. I think if you've got a bad cold or a cough, I think it's kind of a common courtesy, actually, if you're going out and about, to maybe put a mask on. I think one of the upshots of the pandemic, there weren't very many silver linings, but one of them is that we've got a better sense of public health around respiratory conditions. And actually, I mean, I don't think it's something that's going to get taken up en masse. I think probably people without symptoms, we're not going to see many people without symptoms not putting a mask on. But, you know, I was one of the people who had a bug over the Christmas break. Lots of people did. There's some really nasty cold bugs and viruses going around at the moment. It's certainly something I'd do if I was going on public transport. I mean, I think Nicola Sturgeon's right. Try and stay at home if you're ill. And again, I think that's something we're getting better at as a result of the pandemic.
All right.
But it's common courtesy, isn't it? You don't want to be coughing and spluttering all over people when you're not feeling well.
Pre the pandemic, of course, we didn't get this sort of advice, did we?
No, we didn't. But I think the pandemic has obviously changed everything. But I think the nub of this issue is the sort of slippery slope idea, which is that if we are sort of telling people they have to do this to preserve the NHS, like where does that end? I mean, we all know that the NHS has serious existential problems that it's currently facing. So to me, the issue is, you know, why stop with, you know, advising people to do this? Is it, you know, this is also in the sort of obesity thing. Don't eat too much junk food because of the NHS. Don't do this because of the NHS. And you end up having a society that's paying taxes for a dysfunctional health system while also being begged or asked by the government to live their lives in certain ways to preserve that health system. In terms of the masks themselves, I mean, I think the problem was that there was crap messaging around masks in the first place. Britain was one of the worst countries in the West, actually, with its mask etiquette. You'd go on the tube in the height of the pandemic and half the people wouldn't be bothering. So I think the message about why masks are important never really got through here.
I don't think that was the same in Scotland, if you don't mind me interjecting. I think that we did have pretty good adherence to wearing masks at that really, you know, pinch point time when things were so difficult. And, you know, I wonder, you know, what the reason for that is. You know, I wonder if maybe some of that was about messaging. I think the messaging was a bit different in Scotland during the height of the pandemic. But for me, what you're saying about, you know, that the government shouldn't be giving us health and wellbeing advice, I reckon that they probably should. You know, I think that's a responsible thing.
Fine, but I think in a sense we're all agreeing because everyone can decide. You know, I'm seeing people on the tube now all the time wearing masks. It's completely fine to wear a mask, but I think people are a bit unclear in England anyway about why you would wear a mask. So the idea of self-protection is a good reason to wear a mask. But I think the problem is the government advising you to wear a mask because it's good for you, or the government advising you to wear a mask because it's good for the NHS, are two different things.
Sure. I think one of the things I really want to avoid, and where I will go bananas, is any suggestion that we should have children's back wearing masks in schools. You know, there's a real fear that we get back to those types of
Is there a
states.
real
So
fear? Are people worried about that?
I think there is. We've had long periods of time where there was sort of heavy-handed advice coming from government, you know, for good reasons often. But what we've got to be is adults can make their own minds up. And like Sonia said, if you're feeling that unwell, you know, not going out is the right approach. But let us make our minds up. We don't need politicians to stand up.
Well,
and tell us
just
about
briefly
that.
before we move on, Kirsten, do you think this will become an annual message from Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister? You know, when the NHS is under pressure, please wear a mask because it might help.
Do you know, I think it's difficult to say because the world has moved on since the COVID pandemic hit us all. We weren't prepared for this in so many ways, were we, mentally, never mind in terms of all the practicalities. And so I think that we are kind of playing catch up, all of us, in our own minds about how we need to conduct ourselves, how we need to behave. So I think it'll come down to whether COVID remains such an issue. And it is an issue. COVID hasn't gone away. So if we can do something to keep ourselves safe and minimise the pressure on the NHS, then it strikes me that that's a sensible thing to do.
Everybody knows that strikes are happening at the moment, and there are more in the pipeline, possibly by ambulance workers, driving examiners and bus drivers. Primary school teachers are taking strike action for the next 2 days in Scotland, and next week there are more strikes in the diary for nurses. Let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. Ministers to unveil anti-strike laws as disputes continue to paralyse UK. We talked about this minimum service legislation, the idea about public sector services able to maintain a minimum service level during strike action. Should the government press ahead with this, Siobhan?
I think so. I mean, I haven't seen the legislation yet. I'm here. But what we want to achieve is that minimum level of safety, and something actually that the nurses made proposals about and stuck to in terms of their striking, but actually make sure that it goes across the board. I mean, these proposals are setting the scene that is already happening in Spain, France, Germany. What we're also suggesting is that effectively the discussions with the unions aim to reach an agreement about minimal safety standards, but if that agreement cannot be reached with what happened with the ambulance unions, that there will be a backstop of statutory minimum cover. What's wrong with it, Kirsten?
Do you know, the whole approach of the UK government to employment relations and the way that they've dealt with these conversations about pay and about strikes, I think it's been
But on the minimum service level, do you have
wrong-headed.
Right, and I understand that completely. But what's your sort of principal objection to the idea of having a minimum service? I mean, perhaps constituents in Scotland would like to see that when it comes to nurses or ambulance drivers on strike.
No one wants to see strikes, and that includes the people who are taking this action at the moment. But, you know, that has to always be underpinned by a properly respectful dialogue. That's definitely not happened with the UK government. It has to also be underpinned by people's rights to withdraw their labour. And again, nobody wants to see that happening. I certainly don't want to see that happening. But people's fundamental rights are at stake here. So the way to deal with this is not by this, I think, you know, really perplexing and damaging way of dealing with workers and with employment. The way to deal with this is to make sure that proper dialogue happens, that proper discussion happens. That will result in us having appropriately staffed services, and that will result in people feeling and being respected at their work. And all of that's missing in the UK government's approach at the moment. Their approach to employment is
safety and
so
service.
disappointing.
Minimum safety and service. So it's not going to prevent people striking. It's also not going to prevent discussions and trying to reach agreements where there are disputes. What we're trying to achieve, you know, we talk about workers, there's millions and millions of private sector workers that are not able to strike, that have been hugely disrupted and affected by the strikes that have been happening in this country. And equally, some of the pressures on places like our health services and the ambulance, they haven't been helped by the strike. And what we're trying to do is create a balance. So what is the balance that helps the country keep going and get our productivity going and keeps a look at workers across all sectors?
Is it going to undermine people's right to strike?
Yeah, I think it will. And I think we've got to look at this legislation and what it's for and whether it's actually needed. So we saw nurses, for example, they reached agreement. We saw, for example, with the ambulance worker strike, there were picket lines where there weren't any ambulance workers because they'd all been called out to critical calls. This idea that paramedics and nurses are not going to offer life-saving care during a strike, I think that's something the government's looking to shore up, but it doesn't stack up when you look at what happened. I think, actually, the nursing union has pushed back with the government with a really effective response, which is one of the reasons we're striking is because this service isn't safe. Nursing isn't safe because we don't have enough nurses. Paramedics are striking and they're saying the ambulance service isn't safe because outside of strike days, if you've got a life-threatening condition, sometimes you have to wait too long for an ambulance. They're saying if you agree on minimum service levels, why don't we have statutory minimum service levels year-round that the government is obliged to meet? And I think that's something that the government really doesn't have a response to. The reason we've got these strikes is because nurse pay has fallen in real terms by 8% over the last decade. That is leading to a staffing crisis, creating unsafe care in the NHS. It's not acceptable.
I mean, is it appropriate response from the government to the situation?
Well, I mean, I think the situation is actually a bit of that's exactly the problem. I think there's quite a difference between the different strikes going on. I think when it comes to the rail unions, I think it's interesting. That's not getting, it's unclear what the minimum service means in terms of the rail. And I think
the minimum safety,
minimum
as the government
safety,
will call it,
yeah. I mean, I think the whole rail strike situation is extremely unsympathetic, actually. And I think it comes across as greedy, and people are not sympathetic to very well-paid people already who are worried about being phased out because of technology, which is understandable, but that's what's going on there. With the nurses and the paramedics and the ambulance drivers, people really understand that. And after COVID, when they've been through hell, and there's a sense that they are really underpaid, and these are fundamental. But the problem is the government's approach is sort of twiddling little bits of legislation constantly, but never actually dealing with the underlying issues. So you can twiddle and twiddle and twiddle and make little new bits of things that make it harder for people to protest or harder for people to strike. And fine, those things are inconvenient to the country. But what about the underlying problem that the NHS just basically completely doesn't work anymore? I mean, this sort of basic minimum safety is not going to help with overhauling the fundamentals.
Siobhan?
Listen, I was on my feet yesterday challenging the Health Secretary to say that the additional money, more billions of pounds going into the health service will reach frontline workers. And you're absolutely right. There are so many things that need to be supported. I mean, I'm doing campaigns for midwives. Midwives are crying out about safety. But what we're talking about here is, ultimately, looking across the country, the impact of these strikes. There are a lot of people that are expecting the government to make changes to make sure that the country keeps moving, and there is nothing in this proposed legislation that will prevent the striking, and it's not. I've heard the Labour Party trying to suggest that it means we're going to imprison all nurses.
Well, people might lose their jobs. Isn't that a logical conclusion if employers might be able to actually take action against unions if they don't keep to a minimum service?
It'll become part of a contractual arrangement.
Right.
So you will know that you might not be able to strike for the entire week, but you might do a day, and then it'll be on a rota basis.
I mean, wouldn't NHS patients in Scotland appreciate that?
I think NHS patients in Scotland probably appreciate the fact that in Scotland we've not had NHS strikes. There is that.
But you have had other strikes on critical services.
And I think that people appreciate that this is something that is not done lightly by any worker.
But you've got teachers on strike. You've got teachers on strike for the next 2 days, and secondary school teachers going on strike.
Absolutely. And again, the dialogue continues with that group of workers.
Yeah.
They also have had a really
hard time. But would parents appreciate perhaps minimum service from teachers while people go out on strike?
I'm sure that the teachers do a significant service, but it is important for us to have a balanced approach to this. And the approach that Siobhan and her colleagues are taking is very far from that. It's really detrimental to all of our services, whether it's health, whether it's education, or even, you spoke about the rail workers. It's really detrimental to all of these services if we cannot have a sensible dialogue, if we can't have people's ability to work in a constructive way with their employers, with government. That's really damaging. What I think should happen actually is that the UK government should get a grip of this. They should have proper conversations, and while they're about it, they should devolve employment law to Scotland so that if they can't deal with this properly, as evidently they can't, then we can have a much more constructive approach to dealing with fair work in Scotland.
I mean, is this legislation really the answer, Siobhan, to resolving the strikes? I hear what you say about keeping the country moving, but is it actually a resolution? It's not going to come on board anyway for this sort of set of strikes. So I mean, is it answering the wrong question, if that's the
I think it's
right
one of a range of things that have been happening, and we know particularly with the health service, the Prime Minister's making the health service, health and social care, an absolute priority. We've seen more money going in, 3.3 billion for the next couple of years. We've seen additional priorities.
But this is about pay, isn't it?
But on pay, the independent body and the independent review body, the government is having discussions this week. They're talking about transparency on the information going to the independent review body. So the legislation on the minimum service levels is just one part. But I do think that when we look at the disruption to the country that everybody has faced in the recent months, that people are expecting legislators to come up with some new solutions, and this is one of them.
Grant Shapps, the Business Secretary, is up in the House, I think, in the next 45 minutes talking about this. I just want to show you this headline in BBC News. Energy bills support for firms to be reduced from April. It's being reduced quite significantly by as much as 2/3. You can find more details about it on the BBC website. And for those of you who, of course, were watching Politics Live yesterday, you will know we discussed this at length, the impact on business with the owner of a hair salon in Peterborough and her experiences of dealing with rising energy costs. You can catch up with that discussion on the iPlayer. Let's move on and look at this headline in The Times. Westminster poised to intervene over gender bill assent. Now, there were mixed reactions. You heard them there in Holyrood when the Scottish Government passed a law to make it easier for people to legally change their gender in Scotland. The UK Government has said it opposes the changes and may move to block it. Let's talk to our LGBT and identity correspondent, Lauren Moss. Hello to you, Lauren. Tell us, what is the Scottish Government's plan?
Hi, well, this is essentially a bill that will make it quicker and easier for somebody to change their legal sex. That's the sex on their birth certificate. Without changing legal sex, people can already change their passport with certain documents. They can change their driver's licence, the way they identify socially, the certain services that they access, or facilities like toilets, for example. This doesn't intersect with that. But what it does do, it will essentially allow somebody to get married or have a civil partnership in the gender that they identify as. It will change their sex for tax purposes and on their birth certificate as well. So what the bill in Scotland will do is change the law as it stands at the minute of the application of this. It will lower the age from 18 to 16. It will also remove the need for a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, which is the sense of unease a person feels if their gender identity does not match their biological sex. And it will also remove the wait time of 2 years that somebody would have to provide evidence that they've lived in what's called their required gender for, from 2 years to 3 months, with a 3-month reflection period afterwards. And to give you an idea of the numbers of how many people this could apply to, there are 30 gender recognition certificates issued in Scotland roughly every year now. And Scottish ministers predict this could have a tenfold rise from around 250 to 300 a year, which is something similar that's been seen in the Republic of Ireland, which introduced a similar sort of self-ID system and process back in 2015.
So what's the UK's government response been to this, except, and on top of what I've already said, which is to block it in some way?
Well, just because the bill was voted for before Christmas, it certainly doesn't mean that's the end of it by any stretch of the imagination, like what you were just saying then. It's about a month or 3 weeks now before it will then go to receive royal assent. And within minutes of this bill being voted for, the Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Jack, released a strongly worded statement saying the UK government had concerns about it, which we already knew, and were considering a number of issues around how it could intersect with the Equality Act, which the Scottish government doesn't have the power to pass any law which could interfere with the law around equalities. And one of the options they said they are considering is something called a Section 35 order under the Scotland Act. And what this effectively does would block this bill being passed or going for royal assent on the grounds that it would interfere with that law I just mentioned around equalities, which Scotland doesn't have the power to do. Now, this order has never been put forward before, so it would be quite unprecedented. If the UK government did do that, it's highly likely that the Scottish government would then move for a judicial review, and we'd see all of this playing out in the courts. And in the background of ongoing discussions around independence, you might imagine that might be something that Westminster would want to avoid. There is another route as well, though, which could be to amend or sort of update the Gender Recognition Act for the rest of the UK, which would see the certificates issued in Scotland not being accepted or recognised in the rest of the UK. And it's that the Minister for Women and Equalities, Kemi Badenoch, seemed to sort of indicate as something that's being considered yesterday. In a written ministerial statement, she said that the UK is going to update the list of countries that it accepts gender recognition certificates from. Now, at the minute, there are about 40 countries and overseas countries and territories where certificates are accepted in the UK without any additional paperwork. 11 or so of those have a self-ID process, like Denmark and Malta and Belgium, and the list hasn't been updated in over 10 years. And Kemi Badenoch said they're now looking at this list because some of these countries don't have what she called robust processes in place.
Right.
And they may have to meet additional requirements if those countries are then removed.
Okay.
Scotland obviously isn't an overseas country, so we don't know how that will affect Scotland, but it's certainly laying the groundwork, I think, for continued opposition. And we'll find out more about this in the coming weeks, I'm sure.
Lauren Moss, thank you very much. We're joined now by Robin White, a barrister and author who has written a book about transgender law. Robin, welcome to the programme. Why do you support these changes in Scotland?
Good afternoon. Well, I'm trans myself, and I were I gay, I don't have to put myself in front of a panel to decide who's gay enough to achieve the legal protections that those of different sexual orientation achieve. And why should I and other trans people not be believed in who we say we are? Why is that not good enough?
I mean, you changed your gender a long time ago, I understand, but you didn't go through a gender recognition certification process. So what was your personal experience of being recognised in your current gender?
Very easy. As your correspondent has said, I can get a changed passport, I can have a changed driving licence.
Yes.
I practice professionally under a changed name and set of pronouns. But, and she mentioned a number of matters where that change doesn't occur unless one has a GRC. Were I to die, for example, then I'm recorded as male on my death certificate. And that's a horrendous circumstance for someone, perhaps the partner of a trans person who has to deal with that. So there are a number of areas in which having a changed birth certificate is very important to trans people.
I mean, what's the sort of basis, if you like? People might say, why reduce the time of living in your acquired gender from 2 years to 3 months? I mean, it sounds quite arbitrary. I mean, why not scrap it altogether? Why not propose not having it at all?
Well, and indeed, that was part of the discussion in Scotland. I had, frankly, fought against my trans nature for 30 years until the time when I finally transitioned. So I was in no doubt as to who I was.
Right.
It was the societal pressures, perhaps, that held me back for those many years.
But then do you understand why having a substantial period of time then would be wise?
Well, I think the evidence is that trans people know who they are. And I suspect that I support the compromise period of a short period of months because it's a very important change.
Yes.
In someone's life, very significant change that someone needs to make. And it's not a change that should be entered into lightly. And the Scottish arrangements obviously involve a statutory declaration, which is a very significant public statement,
all right.
Public legal statement. And that isn't entered into by anybody lightly or on a whim.
Right, OK. Well, Robin, stay with us because we're going to open it up to the rest of the panel. Siobhan, is the Scottish Government right to make it easier for people to legally change gender?
It's not. I personally wouldn't remove the doctor's, the additional step with the doctor.
The medical diagnosis.
That's my person. I haven't gone through all the debates and proposed legislation, but I think in terms of whether it's reasonable for Westminster and the Prime Minister and the ministers here to be looking at this, where there is a clash or an incompatibility with established legislation like the Equalities Act,
yes,
or where there are genuine concerns being raised by women and girls about safety issues, I think it's fair that ministers here should look at those issues. And we're very keen to have laws that make women feel safe where it's public sexual harassment on the street. So I think this is something that has to be looked at very carefully. And that, I mean, whether it's blocked or not is a whole different ballgame. But I think it's right that they look at it. Right.
Well, I mean, what's wrong with looking at it? I mean, there is a difference here, isn't there, between what the Scottish Government has done in terms of passing this law and what the UK Government says could be in conflict with the law here.
There's often differences between the approach of the Scottish Government and the approach of the UK Government. I must say I welcome that. We've just had that discussion about strike action and employment relations. That's another example of very different approaches. But in Scotland, I think that, let's pull this back to what has actually happened in the Scottish Parliament. So the democratically elected MSPs in the Scottish Parliament have voted for this course of action. That is what should happen. That's a proposal that was in the manifestos of 4 of the 5 parties in the Scottish Parliament. It has support of members of all of these parties, and it's very clearly the will of the Scottish Parliament.
And is it right for the UK Government, in the way Siobhan has just said, to raise concerns because they think it might be in conflict with equality law here?
Well, I don't think it is in conflict with equality law here. And what I would also say to Siobhan, in terms of the medical dysphoria issue that she would like to see retained. The World Health Organization doesn't support that as the way forward. It's what the Scottish Government is looking to do with the support of the MSPs across the Parliament who voted with them is to make this process simpler for a group of people who are in a really marginalised position in society. We've heard from your previous correspondence that this is a very small group of people who will be affected by this, but at present, the circumstances that they are forced to deal with make life more difficult for them than it needs to be.
But there are concerns on the other side, as you know, and we've discussed on this programme before. But Zoe, the United Nations High Commissioner, agrees very much with Robin White and Kirsten Oswald that there isn't any evidence, he says, in countries where it's easier to change gender results in abuse of the system by predatory males. Are you reassured by that?
No, and also he may say that, but I mean, actually, even Sonia wrote a brilliant article recently about this, which says there are plenty of incidents of that exact thing happening. And it's also, that's not really how law and safety works. If you have a system that can easily be abused, once a law changes, it almost invites in abuse, then I think you absolutely should be concerned. And I think we need to boil this down. The point of this is that the arguments against having a pretty stringent medical analysis of a diagnosable medical condition, gender dysphoria, seem to be really strong when you think of all the people, all the women and girls who may think, well, actually, I'm not sure I feel comfortable having someone who's just self-ID'd come into my changing room and seeing my small daughter naked when they've got male genitalia. I mean, that's literally what it does boil down to. It makes it much easier for that to happen. Even, of course, the vast majority of people who would never dream of doing something like that, that's not what they're in it for. But, you know, Robin's comparison to being gay, I think that's slightly misleading because gay does not have anything to do with the spaces you're allowed into.
Right. I mean, it is true. The UN Special Rapporteur, someone different on violence against women and girls, Reem Al-Salem, said last year it would potentially open the door for violent males who identify as men to abuse the process of acquiring a gender certificate and the rights that are associated with it.
Violent men are a problem. None of us, I suspect, on this panel
and are you opening the door to them having an extra opportunity?
No, violent men don't need a gender recognition.
Can I just come in on that?
Finish, and then you'll have an opportunity.
Sorry, I promise. I'll let you come back in.
To come in. I mean, you know, I'm sure that we all will, and we all should. Violent men are the problem here. A gender recognition certificate will not change people's access to single-sex spaces. It won't change the difficulties that we all face because of the worries that I'm sure we all have about male predators and violent men.
Well,
this is just a different issue, and
let me just
agree on the safety of women and girls.
Well, why do you say it won't change? I mean, Sonia, you obviously think it will.
Well, as a journalist who's written about this, I've canvassed a wide range of legal opinion. Several expert discrimination lawyers that I've spoken to say that, and it was confirmed by a very clear legal judgment in Scotland, that whether or not you have a gender recognition certificate changes the threshold at which it becomes permissible and lawful to exclude somebody who's biologically male from a female-only space. Coming to this point about predatory men, it's common sense, right? If you're a male sex offender and you get off on voyeurism, or exposure, the fact that you can get a certificate on the basis of self-ID with no medical diagnosis, declare yourself legally female for the purposes of the law, and then that gets you access to certain female-only spaces, you know, that, of course men are going to use that in bad faith, and it has happened. So, for example, in California, in a Californian spa, somebody who we now know is a registered male sex offender exposed himself in a female-only changing room that included a teenage girl. When a woman complained, she was called transphobic. That's a woman, you're transphobic.
Well, Robin, let's get Robin's response. Listening to that mixed range of views, but particularly on the points about whether it will be abused, this change in the system or a relaxation in the law.
We should make law based on evidence, and good journalists and, frankly, good politicians should be reassuring people and not promoting the stories that cause concern.
But are you saying those stories aren't happening?
Now, do let me work through the point.
Yeah.
So we already have about 230 million people who live under a system where gender can be self-declared. And the committee in the Scottish Parliament worked very carefully through a consultation process that examined the evidence, not people's fears, not people's concerns, but the evidence of what actually happens. and the good old paragraph 472.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm a lawyer.
Yes.
of the report at stage 1 ends by saying that there was no concrete example brought forward to the committee.
All right.
And the UN expert on sexual orientation and gender identity said very clearly that there was no evidence that making the process complex to change.
Well, let me let Sonia respond, because I read that, and that is true. And
that consultation by the Scottish Parliament has been widely criticised as not being fair and balanced. What MSPs in favour of this legislation have said, they've said there's no evidence, there's no sort of academic studies. There are individual cases of this happening. They've been dismissed as anecdote. The issue is that in a lot of countries where self-ID exists, if someone legally changes their sex, those crimes are recorded as female crimes, even if that person is biologically male. These things are not being tracked. So it is wrong to say that there is zero evidence. An absence of robust academic evidence does not mean that there is no evidence that this brings risk. When you're looking to change the law...
Well, let Robin respond.
Sure.
On the very day that I gave evidence, there was evidence by 3 academics recorded in the committee proceedings who had studied these matters elsewhere. And you don't make law based on anecdotes or single instances. If a single red-headed person happens to be a criminal, we don't criminalise all red-headed people. The Scottish Government, as part of the process, announced that there would be changes to the statutory instruments that deal with sex offenders in Scotland, sex offenders, not trans people, that would mean that there were opportunities to block or delay or interfere with them gaining a gender recognition certificate.
All right.
So the Scottish Government is dealing with it where it should be.
And a lot of people don't think those safeguards are worth the paper they're written on, because they rely on people coming forward and declaring that they are a sex offender. There's also a lot of men who commit sex offences who aren't convicted, because a tiny proportion of sex offences like voyeurism and exposure actually see a day in court.
But we are talking about
a conviction.
But we are talking about a group of vulnerable people, transgender people, for whom this is an intrusive and very long process, as transgender people would argue. Is it not right to at least look at making it easier?
No, well, why? Okay, so is it, given that now we live in times when there's a range of experts, extremely highly trained psychologists and doctors who focus exclusively on gender dysphoria and gender identity problems, I obviously, having not transitioned, couldn't say whether it really is so terrible and intrusive. But my understanding is that it probably is a process that if you had experienced gender dysphoria from toddlerhood or early childhood, which is in the scientific literature, when gender dysphoria tends to be diagnosed, you will be thrilled to have medical intervention that confirms your dysphoria and affirms your gender identity. So this idea that it's so terrible that we ask people to go through, when given that you live in a society and the risks are so obvious to women if this is self-ID goes ahead.
I know, because
actually...
Are you prepared to take those risks? Is it worth taking those risks?
I think it would be important to quantify what these risks are. Trans people are of themselves as a group not a risk. The risk that I think we will all agree on is predatory and violent men. That is the risk.
But there's also a dysphoria thing here.
If I can continue, what we need to do is just to maybe go back and reflect on what has happened here. The Scottish Parliament has voted for measures which were widely supported
deeply unpopular with the Scottish public.
Significant and lengthy consultation, after taking significant expert guidance.
All right.
That's as things should.
No, and you say that, but hang on, I just want to get Robin's...
And the measures should therefore be brought into place, and I think that it is a progressive and sensible measure to make that
clear
for a marginalised
for young people who are too easily and too hastily transitioning. We know this now. The medicine and the treatment, the ways of thinking about gender dysphoria.
I actually think there's a very good compromise
and trans people often say we should slow down the process. Like it's not a clear-cut thing that all.
Well, let me get Robin's response to your thing about the dysphoria. I mean, would it be useful? Isn't it useful, Robin, to have a medical diagnosis for people who perhaps aren't sure or want advice and guidance through this process?
Firstly, the waiting times for trans people are unbelievably long. So the numbers of the appropriately trained medical professionals are completely inadequate to deal with trans people's needs in the UK. But it's not, I think we are making the move from regarding being trans as being some sort of medical condition, exactly as we did with being gay, to understanding that it is part of the rich tapestry of human life and that some people are trans.
Sonia.
We need to get over that.
Of course some people are trans. This is about balancing the rights of different marginalised groups, including women using domestic abuse services, for example, and marginalised people who may be trans. I think there's a really good compromise here. I've got no issue with gender self-ID, a legal recognition of someone's gender. It would sort out the death certificate issue, which I think is very important that Robin mentioned. But we have to be clear that legally changing your gender does not change your sex for the purposes of the Equality Act and does not affect the law on single-sex services, which are really important for marginalised women. That's a great way of balancing everyone's rights, but the Scottish Government haven't done that and they've refused to look at those sorts of compromises.
Should the government block this?
I think it's really tricky because I think it does lead to a big constitutional showdown and in some ways plays into Sturgeon's hand. But the fact of the matter is it does interfere with the operation of the Equality Act. So on a point of principle, I think the government does need to step in for the sake of, you know, balancing rights of different groups here.
I think there's a really interesting legal position because if the Badenoch solution goes ahead...
Kemi Badenoch, yes, the Minister.
And we revise the list of countries, and presumably include Scotland, from which a GRC will not be accepted because many countries have moved now to a self-declaration model. It's going to be very hard when the government, if the government think about the Section 35 issue, which they've got about another week to do, because if they have stopped Scottish gender recognition certificates having any effect in England, how are they going to argue that Section 35, invoking Section 35 is justified? Because there will be no effect.
All right.
It's going to be really interesting
Robin,
the next week.
Robin White, thank you very much for joining us. We've only got a few minutes left, but I would like to look at the issue of childcare reform because it's a big political issue for both the government and the opposition. Let me just show you quickly this headline in the Times. Don't ditch my childcare reforms, Liz Truss says Rishi Sunak. These are reports that the Prime Minister has dropped. The idea of reducing the staff-to-child ratios in childcare and nursery settings. First of all, should they be dropped or should he adopt what Liz Truss wanted to do as part of her supply-side reform and relax that ratio?
So I've been working on this for quite a few years. I've been pecking Rishi's head for a long time. Got a report out with Onward, the think tank, that comes up with some solutions. I mean, this is a kitchen table issue for parents, grandparents, childcare sector.
So should he adopt
the employers? So that is one part and one suggestion.
And are you in favour? Are you in favour of it?
Our report suggests that ratios shouldn't change at this time.
Zoe?
I think ratios should become more flexible, and I think that it's just so obvious that we can talk about gender equality all we want, but the toss-up between motherhood and work remains hideous in this country.
Right.
It's one of the most expensive places for... And so therefore, actually, but I think we should transform this. It's all just fiddling. We need to get creches and workplaces instead of giving people fancy packages.
I think we need to go further than that. I think we have free universal schools. Sure. Why on earth don't we have free universal childcare for 0 to 5s like they do in some Scandinavian countries? That's what allows parents.
And the ratios? Would you be happy to see more children being looked after?
No, because I think actually the savings we're talking about just one age group, for age 2, it's pretty marginal savings. Childcare should be expensive. We should have highly qualified individuals looking after our children in their early years, giving them educational opportunities. But it should be something that's funded by us all as taxpayers.
Or by workplaces, instead of offering like glossy packages for egg freezing, which is great too. But why not? I mean, why can't all these corporates supply brilliant creches in the States? Well, I know some I mean, I don't know if they do that here, but it's perfectly possible, and it does happen in some workplaces. Women can go to work.
We've only got a few seconds. It is more relaxed in Scotland, a bit.
It's very slightly more
but it's
relaxed. But I think that these points about it's about all of our families. About every household with children.
There's 1.2 million vacancies and parents are telling us they can't work at full
Well, then
tilt
one
because
question
of
to you
this.
then, Siobhan. Should it be front and centre? Is Rishi Sunak making a mistake not to make this front and centre?
He really cares about this. He is looking at reforms, and we're a bit. Look at the onward
follow
report.
the lead of the Scottish government.
What can we do in the spring budget? What can we do on a long-term reform package? But there's 8 schemes at the moment that are a complete muddle, so we can make changes. So it's good.
It's goodbye from us. Thank you to all of our guests here. I'll be back tomorrow, of course. Prime Minister's questions.